Now is the time to cross over from ashes to beauty. We have been forged in the fire of adversity, called to return to our first love. Follow the ancient paths as we discover the hidden word of Yahuah. This is Crossing Over with Jessica Arianes.
Kundalini training is one of the final trainings in the Power Yoga Master Training Program. And Kundalini is a term you hear about in yoga. If you've been around it for a while, you're going to hear about it. But it's something that's alive, or something that we've all experienced, whether you've done yoga or you've not done yoga. So what is it? Kundalini is really the power of the soul. It's this power or energy that's potential in each of us. So in this training, we're looking at the techniques and the specific yogic approaches to awakening it. The yogis and the ancient sages found that there was a science to unlocking the soul's power, soul's potential. And the techniques rely on all the foundation material of yoga, but now they bring them to a head. They really bring them to an apex point so that we can tap into the sublime power of the soul.
If you activate this dimension of energy, other dimensions of life will open up. Kundalini yoga in its essence is the most dangerous form of yoga. I'm saying dangerous because it's the most potent also. So what is Kundalini?
And in today's video, we are going to be looking at what a Kundalini awakening is. So let's just get straight into the video. So a Kundalini, also known as Shakti, Shakti basically means power in Sanskrit. So this Kundalini, aka power, is a feminine creative energy that is said to live in each and every one of us. So a Kundalini is seen as a snake coiled up at the base of our spine, ready to travel up all across on the top of our spine to be awakened right at the top of our head. If you are someone that has been experiencing a lot of snake dreams or cobra dreams, or have been feeling very drawn to snakes, then this is definitely a subtle sign from the universe that you are ready to be awakened.
Is way bigger than the energy that is in use right now. Only about 21 of your chakras. Out of this 114, if about 21 of them are on, you will live a complete life. You will not feel any inadequacy. You will live a complete physical life. There'll be no problem with your life. You will think you're a great success. But what can we do to activate? There are various ways of doing this, many ways, but the Kundalini yoga.
Many ways, but the Kundalini yoga.
Go into how many ways? There are so many ways of doing it. Essentially, there are 112 ways of doing it.
Hi, I'm Andrew Strom, author of the book Kundalini Warning, False Spirits Invading the Church. Now, of course, that's a very radical title, and I want to show you some of the shocking things and just how similar they are to the Kundalini cults of Hinduism and the New Age movement, Eastern religions. The stuff that's been invading in the last, say, 16 to 17 years, I believe it's the worst invasion in church history. for over 25 years. I've been part of the prophetic movement. I was part of that movement for 11 years. So I saw all of this incredibly alarming and disturbing stuff coming in while I was involved. A guy called Randy Clark came down, saw what was happening, got this impartation through the laying on of hands, got this anointing himself, and he took it into the Vineyard movement. Now here is Todd Bentley explaining how Randy Clark brought this in.
He received a spark of the anointing in Tulsa and in Lakeland came down. And just weeks later, God used him as the fire starter for the Toronto outpouring and the Toronto blessing in January 1994. And we have here tonight Randy Clark. And I asked him to come out, dear Randy, because I know you're a fire starter. And you've been lighting fires all over the world.
All around the world, especially in the Commonwealth countries. We're talking England and all through the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and many other nations all over the world, all through Europe. All of the charismatic movement was into this stuff for the large part. And so this thing became a worldwide sensation just in a couple of years. Now the basic question that we're asking in this documentary is, why are these manifestations so similar to Eastern religions and Hinduism and the Kundalini cults, and yet they're not found in Scripture, they're not found in the Bible, they're not found in classical Christianity at all? Of course, in Hinduism, one of the most common ways of experiencing a kundalini awakening is through a guru placing his hand upon your forehead. This is called Shaktipat. And when they do that, you'll be infused with this incredible love and this wave of emotion. You'll fall down. There'll be all these manifestations, maybe animal noises, joy and weeping and shaking. This is a kundalini awakening, and amazingly, it is exactly the same as what we have been seeing in the Toronto blessing. Now this all began with Rodney Howard-Browne imparting a new anointing into a bunch of leaders, and they spread it around the world. In fact, it spread like wildfire. How do we know that Rodney Howard-Browne had a pure anointing? How do we know it wasn't a Kundalini spirit from the beginning? Because it seems absolutely identical to it. Now, one of the very clearest signs of a Kundalini awakening has always been these Kriyas. You see this woman involved in the New Age movement. She's walking along exhibiting these Kriyas happening, involuntary jerking motions. And the staggering thing about it is that we are seeing again and again and again these exact same type of Kriyas right through the Toronto movement. This has always been one of the clearest signs of Kundalini that we know of.
The clearest signs of Kundalini that we know of.
Well, hi, welcome back, everyone. Sonia Azad here, health and wellness reporter, and I'm joined by Karina Virginia from New York. You're a Kundalini yoga teacher, and we just got done with the Texas Yoga Conference in Houston, which, thank you for class.
Oh, you're welcome.
What a great
so nice
weekend.
having you there.
Yeah, so tell everyone first, what is Kundalini yoga? Because they may have heard of it, maybe not.
Kundalini yoga is the yoga of awareness, and it is a form of yoga that's very accelerated, and it very quickly changes our mindset, changes our energy field, and in order to do that, it can seem a little bizarre. You might be doing a lot of heavy breath work, you might be doing a lot of rapid twists. I like to call it the yoga of miracles. I'm going to show you something really quick that we can do, okay?
Okay, we can all do this at home.
Yes.
All right.
So we're going to pucker our lips like we're little fish, and we're going to inhale through the mouth. Command that breath. Draw it all the way down to the base of the spine, and then take the tip of the tongue, press it up to the upper palate, close your mouth, close your eyes, draw your eyes in while they're closed towards your third eye point right above the bridge of the nose. close your mouth, close your eyes, draw your eyes in while they're closed towards your third eye point right above the bridge of the nose.
Towards your third eye point right above the bridge of the nose.
And now, through your nose, very slowly, exhale and relax your tongue. Do you feel how quickly that changed?
Especially on the exhale.
Yeah, that was pretty intense. All right. Yes. Shalom, everybody. Let's see. So first of all, mic check. Let's make sure that I'm hot and you can hear me. My mic is hot. Is my mic hot? Can you hear me? Give me a thumbs up. I see Dustin, Timothy, Shalom, Laura. Listen, we're going to get into a very in-depth study tonight. So in-depth that I'm actually going to put it into two parts. There's two parts to this particular study because it has to do with prophecy and what I believe is working against the flowing of the Ruach or the outpouring of the Ruach. One of the functions of the Spirit is to reveal truth. And I believe that this Python spirit acts as an antithesis to the Spirit of truth, bringing deception and veiling the individual. So in this particular part, this is part one of a two-part series. I'm going to present back to back, so you can come back at a later time and watch them both consecutively, maybe for Shabbat. But if you yourself or someone you know is struggling with drug addiction, even nicotine, any form of pharmakeia, then it is important for you to watch this broadcast because we're going to deal with what I believe is the principality behind chemical addictions and even imbalances such as bipolar, schizophrenia, and maybe even seizures, epileptic seizures. So we're going to talk about that tonight. We have a lot to go over. I do have a PowerPoint for you so you can keep up with me and take your notes. But again, we're going to talk specifically about a Python spirit. Now, I worked hard on that video last night, and so I emphasized a few things in regards to the kundalini spirit, and I could have mentioned many other esoteric religions and beliefs that are prevalent, but I chose the kundalini because it is the most recent that has invaded faith-based movements. So somebody in the chat had mentioned Bethel. Now, I'm not here to criticize ministries, but if you know of this type of behavior and you yourself have either come out of a ministry where this behavior was encouraged, or if you find yourself in a ministry where this behavior is encouraged, then I would ask you to please, after watching this, do your own research, especially on that kundalini spirit. There is a lot of information out there to help you discern if that is a true movement of the Ruach or if it is a counterfeit spirit, which I came out of the Pentecostal movement. And in various sects of that movement, there were environments where that behavior was tolerated. I mean, I've seen some pretty fantastic stuff. Remember the yogi that just spoke? He called it a fantasy dimension, a dimension of fantasy. So I remember being in that environment. I remember giving myself over to that spirit, what I know now. But as soon as I came out, as soon as the Father pulled me out, praise Yah for the Spirit of truth. As soon as he pulled me out, first thing he began to show me was these videos. I found these videos many, many years ago. I found these videos and Kundalini was introduced to me and I began to study it out and I repented of that. And since then I have not been compelled to behave in such a manner or to I've not been provoked by the Ruach in such a way. In fact, the Ruach is gentle and his yoke is easy. Okay, so we're going to get started. All right, you guys, this is, like I said, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. Please stay tuned about 6:15 after this show or after this broadcast. Then I will present on the Ruach of prophecy, the Ruach of truth that comes from Yahuah and Yahuah alone. So we're going to juxtapose the two. We're looking specifically at the spirit of Python, which is false prophecy that I believe is responsible for false prophets, false prophecies. It's where they get their information. It's the source. Even today, as we see psychics, when we see New Age mysticism, esoteric schools of knowledge that practice divination, fortune telling, palm reading, tarot reading, all of the like, these mediums, these channels. I believe that it is the spirit of Python that is conveying information, half-truths, if you will, to the individual, the host, and then the host is then deceived by that entity. Okay, so let's get started. And yes, we are going to pray for deliverance after the show, but let's get started. And you know, it's interesting because many people message me. Let me remove this. They message me in regards to addictions. And an addiction is not just a choice. It's a stronghold. It's a stronghold in which the individual is compelled. It's a chemical imbalance. And watch, after tonight, it's going to make a lot of sense. But let me share my screen with you. I have the wind blowing in my eye. Hang on. Oh, I see what I did. Okay, hang on just a second, okay? Hang on. Let me get my notes. And you know what's interesting? Let me tell you. I've been working on this for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, but actually concluded it last night. And as I did, let me tell you, headaches. I could not sleep. Massive headache. I mean, I usually don't take pharmakeia, but I was willing to pop some Tylenol. It was pretty intense. Really intense. I mean, to the point where nothing was working. And it was interesting because as a result of studying this, I began to meditate on his word and the difference between a false spirit and the spirit of truth. And just even a little while ago, I think it was maybe an hour ago, as I was communing with his Ruach regarding this topic, I'm just waiting for my notes to transfer over. As I was communing with the Ruach in regards to this matter, I was, and again, just chewing on the truth, meditating on the truth, looking at the heresies and the lies associated with this particular entity and all the branches, and then renouncing them in my own being. I received a revelation, and that revelation relieved me of the pain. So the headache was gone, the neck pain was gone, my backache was, everything that was afflicting me was gone, and I'm good. Very interesting, huh? So I'm sure that the enemy does not want us. Now, why isn't this working? Oh, come on. So I encourage you all to pray, be prayed up. Because, again, I'm sure it does not want us to discuss these issues. All right, let's get started. I think I have it here. It's just taking its, I know that it's getting crazy. I have to turn my Wi-Fi off. Hang on. Just bear with me. I think it should be better now. All right, Abba Yahuah, we just come to you and we thank you for this opportunity, not only to study your word, but to gather together in spirit and in truth. We ask that you would reveal yourself to us because you are the power, that wonder-working power, Father, that delivers us from the snares of the enemy. We need not fret nor be afraid of anything, because your rod and your staff, they do comfort us. Yea, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we shall fear no evil, for you are with us. Abba, yeah, I pray if there's any person here that is struggling with addiction, I pray that you would reveal to the truth to them, and that the truth would set them free. I pray in the name of Yahushua that you would bring healing and deliverance tonight. Father, that by the revelation of your word, people would receive liberty from bondage, whether it's to smoking, nicotine, whether it's to drugs, even food as a form of chemical. If there is anyone here, Abba, that is struggling with mental and emotional imbalance, I pray, Abba Yahuah, that you would bring restoration and a balance to the endocrine system, to the complete body, Abba, from head to toe, that you would bring healing and restoration in the name of Yahushua. We pray for relief. We know that you have come to set the captives free, and we desire that freedom so that we can walk in truth, upright before you, Abba, pleasing you in Yahushua's name. We thank you. All right, guys, just hang on. My system doesn't want to pull up my notes. So let's see. Abba, authority over every hindering spirit, name of Yahushua. And we declare that your Ruach is greater in us than that which is in this world. And you will allow this broadcast to go forth for your glory and your honor. May you be glorified. Thank you. May you receive the glory. May you receive the honor, Abba. Thank you. All right, I got it, guys. Praise Yah. I like when he shows off. He's so good. All right, guys, let's get started. So we're going to talk about the Python spirit, specifically the oracle at Delphi. And again, this is part one of a two-part series. Next, right after this broadcast, about 6:15, we will go over, let me share my screen with you. We will go over the true spirit of prophecy and look at that compared to this particular one. I thought it was important to start with this one first, because you're going to see a lot of nuances and similarities. If you already know a little bit of the word and how Yahuah has ordered his people, and then you'll begin to see some of the inconsistencies here. All right, let's get started. So we're talking about the Python spirit. Is it a thing? Is the Python spirit such a thing, or am I making this up? Like, am I just calling it something that is mystical and stupefying, or is this a real thing? We're going to find out tonight. Here we go. All right, so first and foremost, know thyself. And we've talked a little bit in the past about this word thelema, which is to do as you will. There always seems to be a motto attached to these gods, you know. So do as you will is Aleister Crowley's motto written in the Book of Thelema. And the Book of Thelema is actually a Greek term, thelema, meaning the will, right? Do as you will, dilemma. And it's interesting here, this is Apollo, and he has three mottos that were written at his Delphi, or his temple. And one of them, the first one of the three, was know thyself. But we know in Jeremiah 17:9, we know that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Who can know it? So tonight, just want to make sure you can see me. Yes, you can. Good. Okay. So tonight in this episode, we're going to examine and expose the perverse spirit of Python, which works at misleading others and aims at depriving them of their own free will and their capacity to judge rightly. That's important. okay, because that's connected to Shema or discerning. Now, the spirit of Python is indeed a counterfeit influence. It was very present in the past and it's very present now. This unclean spirit works its manipulation through oracles, Sibyls, and we will define all of these throughout the show. But oracles, Sibyls, false signs and wonders, including visions, premonitions, and dreams. And today, modern Python would be found in the kundalini spirit. This is a perfect example of how that spirit functioned in its cohorts. Now, know thyself. Again, the Bible teaches that people do not know themselves very well. In fact, you've heard the term, I am, searching for myself. While the inscription at the Greek oracle at Delphi exhorted suppliants to know themselves. But we also know that Jeremiah, the prophet, states that you can't, because why? The heart is deceitful. So even if we were to search ourselves out through psychology, through, awakenings or esoteric awakenings, we would still be deceived because the heart is veiled. Okay. So first off the bat, and we're going to talk again about the Oracle of Delphi. Now, the Oracle of Delphi, in the Latin word oracle, okay, comes from oraculum, which means prophecy, specifically by a divine entity or even a priest, so someone who prophesies. And it also means the place, the oracle, where the prophecy is given. This word is actually used in the Hebrew scriptures several times, many times actually, regarding furniture, and on one occasion regarding, I think it's Athihuf, I can't say his name, but it's in here somewhere. Anyhow, so he was called an oracle of Yah, but mostly this word oracle is used to define furniture. But we're going to look at that word oracle in just a little bit. All right, so again, we got this divine entity or a priest or the place in which the prophecy comes from. Now, similarly, the English word oracle has both meanings, okay? So oracle also means the same as the Latin, okay? So the Delphic oracle refers to the place where the prophecies were given, but an oracle can also refer to the prophecy that is given at this particular place. Now you have the oracles. We're going to start with the oracles of Apollo. Now the Delphic, and please stay tuned because I'm going to show you exactly how this affected the church in Corinth. And we're going to look at what was actually manipulating and inducing the woman that Paul or Shaul cast out a demon from. So we're going to look at that. And this is really interesting. But anyhow, some earlier myths claim the office of the oracle was initially possessed by the goddess Themis and Phoebe, and the site was initially sacred to Gaia. Now, Gaia is the Mother Earth, okay, known as Mother Earth, the goddess of the earth. So subsequently, it was believed to be sacred to Poseidon, okay? So remember, the Delphic oracle, according to one myth, a Delphic oracle belonged to Apollo and his priestess called the Pythia, who gave her oracles from inside Apollo's temple. It was believed to be sacred to Poseidon, the god of earthquakes. Now, this is important because we'll find out later how these individuals, these Pythies, how they received their divination. And it was actually through gases or through chemicals that they inhaled or ingested. And as a result, it would provoke them to enter into some sort of trance, just like we saw in the video. So these earthquakes, okay, so Poseidon was the god of earthquakes, and this was believed to be the sacred place of Poseidon. However, during the Greek Dark Age from the 11th to the 9th century BC, a new god of prophecy, Apollo, allegedly seized the temple and expelled the twin guardian serpents of Gaia, whose bodies he wrapped around the caduceus. Very interesting to point out that right there. Now, here you see the caduceus. This would have been what it looked like during that time. And today it's actually used in medicine as a symbol of the medical field. Okay. Why? We're going to find out again, because it has to do with pharmakeia. All right. So according to other accounts, and this would have been what the caduceus looked like. If you can see this picture here, down here and up here, this is what it would have looked like during that time. It was later taken over by Hermes, but it was supposedly, according to the mythology, it was initiated by Apollo. All right. Now, according to other accounts, Gaia, which means earth, by the way, had a snake or dragon named Python that guarded her oracle. Now, when Apollo came to take over the oracle, he first had to kill the dragon in order to take possession of it. Now, in Greek mythology, Python was the serpent, sometimes represented as a medieval styled dragon living at the center of Gaia, or the center of the earth, believed by the ancient Greeks to be at Delphi. Python, that would be the location there, the center of the earth. Now, what's interesting is that Python was also known as Gaia's son and prophesied as Gaia's son. Therefore, Apollo had to eliminate this opponent before establishing his temple at Delphi. All right. Delphi, here we go. So Delphi, isn't that a beautiful backdrop? All right. So in ancient times, Delphi was considered a sacred precinct that served as the seat of Pythia. Now remember, Pythia is the prophetess or the oracle, the person in which the host, if you will. Now the major oracle who was consulted, this was Pythia, about important decisions throughout the ancient classical world. Now according to Suda, the Delphi took its name from the Delphine, which means the dragon. And this dragon, again, as we just read, is apparently this snake or serpent, the son of Gaia, the dragon who lived there and was killed by Apollo. In other accounts, the serpent was called Python. Okay, so Pytho, a sacred precinct. That's what Delphi was. It was a precinct. Now, what's interesting is that once Apollo took over and apparently seized the Delphi, took it from Gaia and her oracles or her priestesses, then he implemented or put in charge his priestesses, his oracles, and they were called Pythia from the word Python. Okay, Pythes or Pythia. And it's interesting because the Greek word pithy or maxim means parable or wisdom. Pithy, okay, means wisdom, a maxim, a conundrum, a hard saying, a dark saying. And again, these Pythia, so pithy, the word pithy in the Greek is connected to this word Python because they believed that the serpent was the emblem or embodied wisdom, okay? All right, so Apollo got his, that's where they got her name. And this is actually a rendition of what she would have probably looked like if you can see the little crack inside the earth. Now listen, if I go off the air or something happens and you're watching and you have my number, text me because I cannot see the screen. I can only see my notes in front of me. So you have to text me and let me know, okay? All right, so the Pythia. Now the Pythia was the name of the high priestess of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, who also served as its oracle, known as the Oracle of Delphi. We have a lot to go through. Now, the name Pythia is derived from Pytho as well, which in myth was the original name of Delphi, as we just read. Now, etymologically, the Greeks derived this place, check this out, this place name from the verb pouthin. Now, pouthin means to rot, which refers to the pungent smell of the decomposition of the body of the monstrous python. After they call it a she, python was a female. And if you remember from the video, the woman that was describing that power or that energy force, she said it was a feminine force or feminine energy. So apparently Python, she was slain by Apollo. We'll say this over and over again because this is the mythology that's connected to the Python, okay? Now, we're talking about Pythia. Pythia is the prophetess or the oracle that would have served Apollo in the Delphi or in the citadel. Now, she was credited, she was among the most powerful women of the classical world. The Temple of Apollo, which, by the way, Apollo was the god of music, harmony, and light. And he was very prominent in the Pan-Hellenic sanctuary. He was a major god in their culture. Now, the prophetess, or the oracle, as we'll call her, the oracle was credited for uttering divine prophecies while under possession. And what's interesting is that this Greek word is enthusiasmos. It's where we get the word enthusiastic. I had to do a lot of repenting as a result of this study because, again, I think we use words without knowledge, and we're quick to speak, slow to hear. But enthusiasm, which it's not necessarily a bad word, but this word enthusiasm was initially used to describe divine possession, right? To be possessed by a deity, and specifically in this case, Apollo. Now, the Delphic oracle, again, the individual that was serving at Delphi, became one of the most prestigious and authoritative oracles among the Greeks. Okay. Due to high demands, the wait time, this is actually what it would have looked like. This is a rendition, so they remade it, but this is what it would have looked like. Now, due to high demand, the wait time to consult the oracle was long and involved expensive sacrifices. And I have done so much research. I wish I could share it all with you, but I can't because I don't think we have enough time in the world. But what's interesting, let me see if I want to put this in there. Well, she was in high demand. Okay, so she only prophesied, I think it was 9 months out of the year, because it was believed that Apollo would descend during the winter seasons. And again, this is all connected to agriculture. So they believed that Apollo would descend into the lower regions of the earth, basically die, and then he would resurrect again during the spring or during the spring equinox. And so she would then prophesy or give her oracles during the time when he was obviously, present, because again, how could he, if their mythology says that he descended or died, then how is it that he could influence her, right? So during that period, she was not influenced, so she would take some time off. Now, modus operandi. Here's what's interesting before we get to that. The most, because of the expensive sacrifices, most of the people who consulted the oracle at Delphi were wealthy individuals, and most of them were heads of state. Okay, so these were very successful people that could afford these sacrifices, but more than not, it was very important people who would want to have their fortunes told. All right. So we're going to talk about modus operandi, her MO, how she worked, right? Her mode of operation. Now, one of the main stories regarding the oracle at Delphi, claimed that the Pythia delivered oracles in a frenzied state induced by vapors rising from a chasm in the rock, and that she spoke gibberish which priest would then interpret as the enigmatic prophecies, and then would later turn them into poetic dactylic hexameters preserved in Greek literature. And it's interesting. Wait, why do I have? Oh, here's the hyperlink. What's interesting is I'm going to read some stuff for you that I don't actually have here. If you give me just a second, because it's way too much. Way too much to actually go over. So I'm just going to read it for you. So again, this is her MO, and you're going to hear a lot of similarities to the Kohanim, the temple, or the Ohel, Mishkan pattern that Yahuah gave to his priest. And you're going to see some of the counterfeit. And again, remember, this is way after. So her mode of operation. So 3 oracles had successively operated in Delphi originally. You had, and I'll probably butcher these names, but you had the Chthonian using echomesis, a procedure, listen to this, that involved sleeping in the holy place so as to see a revealing dream. Now, remember, one story claimed that she would be induced by vapors. So this little sanctuary was located right over that crack in the ground where these vapors would come up out of that ground, and they would become intoxicated by them. So yeah, if you're sleeping in that little room, you're going to get contact high. And as a result, they would have these really vivid dreams. It was psychosis, but they would experience hallucinations and dreams. And then there was another way that the oracles operated. Again, that was ekkoimisi, which is a procedure of sleeping there. And then they would have kleromantion, and finally Apollonian, with the laurel. So they would use these laurel leaves to prophesy as a tribute to Dionysus and Hermes and Apollo. But ever since the introduction of the cult of Dionysus at Delphi, the god that brought his followers into ecstasy and madness, the Delphic god gave oracles through Pythia. So this was the earlier, then Pythia is the latter, who also fell into a trance under the influence of vapors and fumes coming from the opening, the inner sanctum of the oracle. Now, again, it's interesting that so far what we see is that all of these individuals who worshiped these false gods would have to use some sort of medium. And usually that medium was a chemical, which is why in the Greek, the word for witchcraft is translated as pharmakeia. If you didn't know that, look it up. If you were to look up the word witchcraft in the Gospels, you're going to get pharmakeia, sorcery, potions, spells, right? Alchemy, mixing of chemicals, a periodic table, mixing elements, okay? And then creating a chemical reaction. Even though you may be dealing with innate materials, but once they are mixed, or once they are smoked, once they are ingested, then they set off a chemical reaction within you that shifts your paradigm, or creates creates an altered reality, or an altered dimension, okay, which they believe is access to the gods. It's how they access their gods. So it's interesting, so far that seems to be the case. Now, Pythia, the oracle, she would sit on top of a tall gilded tripod, and I have an example for you in just a minute, but a gilded tripod that stood above the opening of the crack that was in the floor. The tripod was perforated with holes. It looked kind of like a cauldron, you know, but instead of being used for potions, she would sit in the base of the cauldron, and she would then inhale these vapors. Her figure, listen to this, and it's just like the video we've seen, her figure would seem to enlarge. She would become bigger. Her hair stood on end. Her complexion would change. And these were actually, again, all of this was recorded in those dactylic hexameters, as well as books and journals of individuals who had experienced her prophecies. So they wrote these things down. So these were eyewitness accounts of what would happen to the women in who were acting as oracles. So it says that her complexion would change, her heart would start to palpitate, more so than not. Her bosom swelled, and her voice became seemingly more than human. It has been suggested that the seizures associated with oracular utterances were exhausting and may have shortened the life of the women chosen to be the oracle. Now, a tripod, that cauldron thing that she sat on, as its name implies, is basically a 3-footed stand, usually made of metal. And so here she's sitting on the cauldron over the fire. There's a smoke coming out. But again, the Pythia would use it to sit, and she was high up. And after, if you look at architecture in ancient Greece, you'll find that, and even in Rome, you'll find that these tripods became very popular as they would sit their monuments and their statues, especially their gods. They would sit them on the base of these tripods. I actually tried to do some research to see if we have, because we have a lot of Roman architecture here in our capital, in our state, in the government buildings. So I was looking, but I think that they used pillars and they used some tripods, but I'm sure that the image changed as a result of time. Anyhow, so after the person would go in and consult the oracle. After the person consulting the oracle asked his or her question, the Pythia, listen to this, would go into a trance. And it was believed that Apollo himself would possess her. So then she would speak, and listen, she was not clear. So they required that a priest or several priests who were standing near would take down what she had said and translate her words into a poem written in those hexameters I mentioned. It is usually assumed that the Pythia's original words were not coherent. Were coherent, but not very clear. Okay, she spoke in gibberish and didn't make much sense. So they had to translate the information. They had to interpret it. Okay, so just imagine if you've ever come across someone who is maybe has a chemical imbalance, on drugs, drunk, under the influence, maybe even a mental disorder, an emotional disorder, and bipolar schizophrenia. Think about, it's very similar to the way that they communicate, and they speak half truths, or some of their stuff is coherent but not very clear, doesn't make much sense. So once the Pythia's words were translated into these poetry, the poem was then written down and given to the person who sought the advice. It was always the responsibility of the recipient. Listen to this. It was always your responsibility to interpret the oracle correctly. So in other words, the responsibility was not on the oracle. As Yah says that the responsibility is given to the prophet, that if the prophet is true, his words will come to pass. If he's false, they will not. But here they were able to find a way around that by stating that, hey, it's secret, it's hidden knowledge, so you have to figure out what it means, and if it's a yes or a no, you have to determine the symbology of it, because their God was not clear on these matters, right? Very interesting. So again, it was your responsibility. So the oracle was always right. It was your interpretation that was right or wrong. And the oracle, even in her final form, and the oracles, even in their final form, were always ambiguous. They were very sketchy. So frequently, though not always, the recipients did not interpret them correctly, and they suffered as a result. But yet they continued to go to her time and time again. So sad, right? Now, there are many later stories of the origins of the Delphic oracle. This one is very interesting. One late explanation, which is first related by the 1st century BC writer Diodorus Siculus, tells of a goat herder named Coritas, who noticed one day that one of his goats had fallen into the crack of the earth. They really love the center of the earth because that's where their Poseidon dwells, right? Or this pithy, this python spirit. So it's where, I guess, the great powers of death. It's the lower faculties, right? So listen to this. One of his goats had fallen into a crack, and as a result was behaving strangely. Now, this guy entered the chasm. And I have a side note for you on, hopefully we'll get to it next week as we talk about other these principalities and rulers, so that we can contend against them, so that we can be delivered from them. But that would be Hades, and so we'll talk about that next week. But anyways, on entering the chasm, he found himself filled with a divine presence. He was high, and he called it a divine presence. And the ability to see outside of the present, take note of that, into the past as well as the future. He was excited, right? He had that experience. He was excited by his discovery, so he shared it with nearby villagers. Many started visiting the site. This is a true account, to experience the convulsions and inspirational trances, though some were said to disappear into the cleft due to their frenzied state. They would, go into a frenzy. So a shrine was eventually erected at the site where people began worshiping in the late Bronze Age by 1600 BC. After the deaths of a number of men, the villagers chose, guess what? A single woman, a young woman, as the liaison for the divine inspirations. Eventually, she came to speak on behalf of these gods. Okay. Now, the Pythia she would bathe herself, which we know as a mikvah, but she would bathe herself in the Castilian spring. Then she would drink the holy waters of the Casotis, which flowed closer to the temple. Remember, this water is probably contaminated, where a naiad possessing magical flowers was said to live. Again, this sounds very mythical, right? But in reality, scientifically speaking, she's probably eating shrooms, or she's probably eating, what's that? Is it Polyander? No, what's the flower? Oh, well, there's lots of flowers that you can make into teas, but I'm thinking of one specifically. Anyhow, so she would drink this water. She would, eat these flowers. She would ingest these vapors. And of course, then she would enter into a transcendental state, right? So Euripides described this ritual purification ceremony in which she would mikvah, or dip herself in the water, or bathe in the water. He described it as a purification ceremony, starting first with the priests, called Eon, dancing on the highest point of Mount Parnassus, going about his duties within the temple and sprinkling the temple floor with holy water. The purification ceremonies, who does that, right? With the holy water. Remember, Yahuwah used the blood, right? The purification ceremonies always were performed on the 7th day. We're almost done with this, and we'll get back to the PowerPoint. On the 7th day of the month, which was sacred to and associated with Apollo. She was then escorted by Hosioi, an aristocratic council of 5, with a crowd of oracular servants. Okay, they would arrive at the temple, and consultants carrying laurel branches sacred to Apollo approached the temple along the winding upward course of the sacred way. The winding staircase, right? They love, it means elevated to them. In esoteric schools of knowledge, or mystery schools, that's what they teach, that the stairs are Masonic, of course, but they represent ascension or ascending. And how do they do that? Degrees of knowledge. This is why in the Freemasons, there are 33 degrees of knowledge, and the highest being the 33, but these are steps, and those steps, even though they're physical steps, become spiritual or esoteric steps as you advance in knowledge. In fact, it was the Freemasons that established the core curriculum in our education system as we know it: mathematics, science, arithmetic, and so on. So they created these higher learnings, these elevation of learning, so that you become, that's why college is called higher learning. Okay. And most classes that transfer into university have to be at one. They have to start with 101, like 100, math 100 won't transfer. It has to be math 101 or higher. 101, right? Math 101, 103, 107, whatever. Okay. So back to what we were saying. So they would ascend up these, the sacred way, they called it. And they were these winding staircases, bringing a young goat kid for sacrifice in the forecourt of the temple, and a monetary fee. So they also had to pay. Now Pythia would then remove, she had a veil, and she was dressed in purple. Her veil, her cloak was purple, like the harlot, and she would wear a short, plain white dress. At the temple fire to Hestia, a live goat or kid would be set in front of the altar and sprinkled with water. Now, if the kid trembled from the hooves upward, it was considered a good omen for the oracle. But if it did not, the inquirer was considered to have been rejected by the god, and consultation was terminated. Now, the goat was then slaughtered upon sacrifice. The animal's organs, particularly its liver, were examined to ensure that the signs were favorable, and then burned outside on the altar of Chios. Now, the rising smoke was a signal that the oracle was open for service, okay? The oracle then descended. She was a hireling. She was paid for service. Imagine how wealthy they became if the lines were days and days. I mean, can you imagine the people? These were expensive offerings. So can you imagine how much they were making off of this oracle? And we're going to get to the Corinth story in just a bit in Acts, which now is going to make so much sense, because, by the way, the Delphi was actually located in Corinth, off the basin of Corinth. But so now you understand what was prevalent there. It was very popular. Apollo was a major god to these people. And so could you imagine they were banking off the people, deceiving them blindly, right? All right. So now the rising smoke, again, we're open for service. The oracle then descends into the Aditon. Now the Aditon is Greek for the inaccessible place. You can't access this place. And again, that would be that little chamber that's right over the crack where all the vapors are. Okay. So think about it. Why can't you access this place? Why is it called the Aditon? So it's called the Aditon because if it's the place where the vapors and the odors are being emitted and you enter, well, then you're going to also become an oracle, right? And then guess what? People are going to become wise and catch on and say, hey, and, you know, can't we all just get along? Why do I got to pay for this service? Anyways, she would then sit on her tripod seat holding those leaves and a dish of casotis, which was basically spring water, into which she gazed. So it was like reminds me of the in the temple where Yahuah puts the brazen laver. The brazen laver was the washing basin where they would wash, right? But instead she used this like water witching. She would use this to gaze in and become a scrying mirror, and she would scry. So this is all sorcery, you can see. So nearby was the omphalos, called the Greek navel, word for navel, which was flanked by two solid gold eagles representing the authority of Zeus, and the cleft from which emerged the sacred pneuma. Now, the reason why I put that in here is because, again, this is where they believed. Pneuma, by the way, is where you get pneuma, pneumatic, pneumonia. Think about it. It's the breath, right? Pneuma is the Greek word for breath. So they believed that it was through the sacred breath that she was inspired. But that source of breath was Zeus. Now, the petitioners would then draw lots to determine who would go in first, order of admission, but representatives of a city-state or those who brought larger donations to Apollo were secured a higher place in line. Each person approaching the oracle was accompanied with a proxinos, specific to the state of the petitioner, whose job was to identify the citizen of their polis. Okay, this service too was paid for. Now, Plutarch, we're almost done. Plutarch describes the events of one session in which the omens were ill-favored, but the oracle was consulted nonetheless. They didn't care. I think they got contact high, and they just really enjoyed the experience of believing that they were discovering stuff about themselves, that they were, in control of their lives and in elements of their lives which they were otherwise not in control of, such as the future, right? Who I should marry, should I have children, should we go to war, where should I go to school? All these things that can cause anxiety, especially if you're struggling. But can you imagine the itching ears of the people? And so even though the oracles or the omens were ill-favored, the people still went. Now, the priest proceeded to receive the prophecy, but the result was listen to this, a hysterical. So this was an occasion where it was written. Plutarch is the author who says that, hey, it was the omens were ill favored, but the oracle consulted nonetheless. Okay, so the priests, they said, just keep working. It's okay if the omens, they tell us we shouldn't, but just go. And as a result, she became extremely hysterical, uncontrollable, and as a result, she died a few days later. So I don't think that it was necessarily that the omens were ill-favored, such that she, for whatever reason, she overdosed. Let's be realistic, right? Like, so we see the myth, but we're exposing these things, we're tearing it down, right? So she overdosed as a result, and they didn't care. They just put in another woman. Now, at times when the Pythia was not available, listen to this, and you can apply it to a lot of the deception that we experience today by those who call themselves, prophets or priests or Yah's people. Now, at times when the Pythia was not available, consultants could obtain guidance by asking simple yes or no questions in which the priests would answer. Now, that reminds me of the Ummum and the Thummum, right? Which, yes or no, black and white, the two stones. Now, a response was returned through the tossing of colored beams. One color, just like the Ummum and the Thummum, one color, black and white stone, would designate either yes or a no. Now, we're going to conclude here with the fumes and the vapors, because there's much more to get to. Now, there have been many attempts to find a scientific explanation for the Pythia's inspiration. However, most commonly, these refer to an observation made by this Plutarch, who presided. He was the high priest at Delphi for several years. He stated that her oracular powers appeared to be associated with vapors from the Kurna spring waters that flowed under the temple. It has often been suggested that these vapors may have been hallucinogenic gases. Recent geological investigations have shown that these gas emissions from a geological chasm in the earth, if they found it, could have inspired the Delphic oracle to connect with the divine. Now, some researchers suggest the possibility that ethylene gas caused the Pythia's state of inspiration. Traces of ethylene have been found in the waters of the Castilian springs in which she would bathe, which is now largely diverted for the town water supply of the town of modern Delphi. However, Lehoux argues that ethylene is impossible and that it was benzene that was the determinant. Now, again, there's lots of arguments. Some even say that the chasm, or the gas that was emitted from the chasm, was CO2 or H2S, stating that it was a result of seismic ground rupture, an earthquake. And yeah, which is interesting because later on, once the earthquakes subsided and there were no longer earthquakes, guess what? There were no more oracles, and the people were like, eh. And it eventually, this practice dissolved. Okay. Now, there's one alternate theory based on review of contemporary toxicological literature that indicates that it is oleander. That's the word I was looking for, the flower, oleander, that causes symptoms similar to those of Pythia. So, but remember, she was actually doing all of these things. She was ingesting the vapors, she was bathing in the water, she was drinking it, she was eating the flowers. So we see that. Okay, she would chew the leaves and inhale their smoke. And what's interesting is that I was meditating on this, right? Because it was mostly vapors or smoke, a chemical that was altering the chemicals, reacting to the chemicals with the natural chemicals within the body and creating an induced state of mind, right? Where the altered state of mind. And what's interesting is that I believe in natural medicine. I believe that Yahuah has given to us the balm of Gilead, or the herbs of the field, in order to benefit, so they can, so that we can benefit from them, even medicinally. Even though he is ultimately Yahuah Rapha, he heals us. But I believe that we can find relief in these things. However, I do believe that when something is taken in its natural state and it is smoked, abused to such a degree that you are now dependent on it. Your pain is not residing. You're not getting any better because your lifestyle has not changed. But diabetes, but you still eat, all the wrong things. You're not altering your diet or exercising or whatever the case is. Then it's an addiction. Then you're under a stronghold. And I do believe that it can, in fact, begin to act as a barrier between you and the truth, the whole truth. Now, I'm not saying you can't have the truth or access the truth, but I believe that then acquiring truth becomes burdensome. It becomes very difficult, something you have to work through, which is why you see so many people who are addicted to drugs, alcohol, or a chemical. You see them struggle to get sober, right? They desire to be sober, so many, and they can get sober for like a couple of hours, and then the chemical reaction, it compels them, and they have to feed that beast. Actually, I knew a lot of people who smoked, drugs or did drugs, snorted, whatever. But the point is that I remember the term when I was out there. They used to say it was chasing the dragon. Chasing the dragon. Isn't that interesting? Because the smoke, right? So the smoke was the dragon. This is again why Python is the dragon or the serpent, but mostly the dragon, because, or Leviathan, this dragon, is so difficult because it's this vapor or the smoke in which the dragon would release his vapor. So yeah, I hope that makes sense to you. But this is why I think it's so difficult for someone to get free from that. It's because of the altered state of mind, the inducement, right? The mind becomes induced by this altered state. And not only that, you have a chemical demand now that is, you have imbalance and you need healing even down on a cellular level. So they would take these, she would eat these oleanders, and then she would go into a fit. They actually called it epilepsy, or they called it the sacred disease. Imagine, so people back then who had epileptic seizures, thank you. They were thought to have been possessed by gods. And yeah. And it's interesting because Yahusha cast out a demon from a person who had these seizures, right? But it's interesting that they called it sacred disease, the sacred disease. And it was the result of being possessed. Now, the oleander fumes, which they believed was attributed to the spirit of Apollo, could have originated in brazier located in an underground chamber called the antron, and have escaped through an opening in the chasm. These would be the oleander fumes, which is why they called it the sweet, sticky aroma, or the sweet aroma that they believed came out from that place. But they said that this was the spirit of Apollo that smelled like the oleander flowers. But they find later on that these were actually located under the chambers or underground in the temple's floor. Of course, it's built on a mountain where there was an earthquake. This hypothesis perfectly fits the findings of the archaeological. They actually did excavations that revealed an underground space under the temple. This explanation sheds light on the alleged spirit and chasm of Delphi. See, it makes sense now. Well, it has been disputed as to how the Adyton was organized, but it appears clear that this temple was unlike any other in Greek. The small chamber that I had mentioned, well, that was located below the main floor. It was set off to the side. It was constructed in such a way that she would be able to remain intimate in that chamber, and the vapors would then contaminate the quarters. And even it says here that there was, the individuals would come close enough that they would be provoked by these intoxicating effects. Think about it, right? This python, this smoke, okay, of divination would then influence them to some, contact high. And then they would probably go about saying, oh, yeah, think about it. So Plutarch reports that the temple was filled, here it is, with a sweet smell, which they again attributed to the deity. Here's his quote. He says, not often, nor regularly, but occasionally and fortuitously, the room in which they seat the gods' consultants filled with a fragrance and breeze, as if the Adyton were sending forth the essence of sweets and most expensive perfumes from a spring, right? Flowers. So now, frequent earthquakes produced by Greece's location at the chasms intersection of 3 tectonic plates, which they found could have caused the observed cracking of the limestone and the opening of new channels for hydrocarbons entering the flowing water of the Casotes. This would cause the admixture of the ethylene to fluctuate, increasing and decreasing the potency of the drug. It has been suggested that the waning of the oracle after the era of Roman Emperor Hadrian was due in part to a long period without any earthquakes. Okay. Now I'm going to end there and we'll get back. Oh, here's another. I thought this was interesting. Let me just tell you this little story. So, and this has to do with how people can become addicted to, these types of things, drugs, witchcraft, and, again, accessing this knowledge, right? So according to Herodotus, Croesus, the king of Lydia, he had once asked the oracle if he should go to war with Persia. Okay. Now, Lydia was a large and very prosperous kingdom in what is now central Turkey, but Cyrus, the king of Persia, had recently expanded his kingdom so that it bumped up against Lydia's borders. Now, Croesus, the king, felt threatened by the Persian expansion, so he wanted to know if he should attack Persia before Persia attacked him. And the Pythia said, listen to this, if you go to war against Persia, you will destroy a great empire. You can find that in Herodotus 153. Now, Croesus, again, the interpretation is your responsibility. So Croesus interpreted this to mean that he would destroy Persia. And so he gathered his forces and attacked. However, Croesus lost the war. And in the end, he was forced to concede and admit that he had destroyed his own great empire. Now, there are many examples of people misinterpreting oracles, usually because, like Croesus, they interpret it according, just like scripture, according to what they want to hear, their own understanding. But there are a few examples of people who interpret their oracles correctly, and of course they benefit. But that's not the way that Yah works, right? He's like, it either is or it isn't. Okay, it either is or it isn't. No falsies here, no takebacks here, and the responsibility is always on the prophet. Always on the prophet. All right, we're back now. I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll get back to the PowerPoint. So, that was a lot of information. I hope you enjoyed that. Okay. All right, here we go. So again, we're talking about her modus operandi, her mode of operation. And we're going to talk about Corinth. And this is not too much longer. I think we got maybe 45 more minutes, about 2 hours. But it's important. So let's see if my screen is being shared. Yeah, we're going to talk about Corinth now. Remember, this place was located in the heart of Corinth. Now, specifically, let's read from Acts 16:16. All of this will make sense to you now, but it gets even better. So, Acts 16:16, and it came to pass as we went into prayer, this is Paul speaking, a certain damsel possessed with a spirit of divination met us, which brought her masters much gain by soothsaying. Now, remember what I said to you earlier. Imagine how much the people were making off of these false prophecies, false oracles, false teachings, whatever. Imagine how much money they were making. Same here. Now, what's interesting is that this spirit of divination, guess what? In the Greek is what? Puthon, the name of the region where Delphi, the seat of the famous oracle, was located. There it is. They specifically said that she was possessed with a python spirit. Divination is, in fact, this python. Okay. Now, python in the Greek, it's the Greek name given to the mythological serpent, remember? That dragon, which lived at Pytho beneath Mount Parnassus and guarded the Delphic oracle. The name became the surname of Apollo, the god of divination in Greek mythology, and hence applied to all oracular and divinatory spirits. Such persons generally spoke with their mouths closed. How do you speak? They murmured, right? They murmured, babbling. Okay. And so you get that word to babble, right? Like you're a babbling fool. Not that you would call anyone a fool, but I'm saying that this is the term. Well, it's interesting because the word babble means confusion. right? Babylon, confusion. So they would speak with their mouths closed, uttering words considered beyond their own control. I'm not in control, like these people we saw in the video. And so we're also known as ventriloquists. In fact, if you were to look up the word for divination in the Hebrew, it actually is interpreted as ventriloquist, or a bottle something. I can't think of it right now. Anyways, but ventriloquist, okay? Because their mouths weren't moving, but they're, you know, and they believe something was speaking through them. They become the dummy host, okay? They become the host. Sorry, guys, I have the fan on and it's like in my face. All right. So now a python, that is by analogy with the supposed diviner there, is basically speaking of inspiration or soothsaying, again, divination. Now, here's an example of Pythia in a logo. It says here, Greek biologically certified cannabis. Now, this is very interesting. Y'all put this on my heart. And I'm not judging anyone. I get it. I know what it is to have an addiction. But what I am saying is, again, it's the vapors or the smoke, especially the vaping. And I'm not saying that you cannot walk in the truth if you are addicted, okay, to any of these things. What I am saying is that when you are addicted to something and it does alter or advise for clarity of mind, then it makes it, I mean, think about it. Yah says that we're to be of sober mind. So if it's through that sobriety or that sober mind, that clear mindedness, that we access the truth and comprehend, Shema, understand, then when we are altering our state of mind, it's going to make it difficult for us to not only comprehend the truth, but walk in it. Okay. So that I'm saying that these chemicals can then act as a barrier, making it difficult, making this walk complicated, okay, making it very difficult, heavy, burdensome. Even you trying to study, even you trying to articulate your faith or share it with someone else. I know a lot of people who say, man, I have it in my head, what I know to be true, but then when I try to go and speak it, it just comes out all, blah, blah, blah. And I can't flow. Well, that's exactly what this is, like a rock in your well, right? It's preventing that water from flowing freely. Okay. Now that's that Pythia, right? Now it's interesting because we just read in Acts, right, that this woman had the spirit of divination. Now what's interesting is that Luke uses this word specifically here. Okay. Look at this word. Manteom. I'm not going to say it right. I had practiced this too. Manteomene, which basically means to divine or to soothsay. But this word is never used of true inspiration or prophetic utterance to describe her oracular speech, which is obviously inspired by a demonic power. And we're going to look at this word soothsaying for just a second. Now, soothsaying means to basically utter spells, enchantments. Okay, stay with me. This is so good. Now, the mantis, this is the root of this word, or the plural of this word, manteomai, were possessed. So the individual who was possessed by this entity was considered possessed of a maniacal fury, which displayed itself by rolling the eyes, foaming at the mouth, flying hair. It is quite possible that these symptoms were sometimes produced by the inhalation of the vapors and or other drugs, as they were often aggravated in the seers. The pythonesis, and Sibyls, so they were called pythonesis or priestesses, and Sibyls and the like, no doubt such belong to a spiritual world, not related to Yahuah, true Elohim, but to the bowels below. So let's look at this for just a second. We're going to talk about Sibyl. I know this is a lot of information, but I think it's necessary to receive the deliverance that we need. So it mentions Sibyls, right? What's a Sibyl? So in ancient Greece, Sibyls were called prophetesses, and they were legendary in their literature. Now, tradition represents these Sibyls as women of old age. They would utter predictions in ecstatic frenzy. Now, remember, we were just looking at the Romans and the Greeks, and she was a prophetess as well, just like the Pythia. And then they would also include her oracles or her prophecies in these hexameters, okay? In the 5th and early 4th century BC, she was always referred to in the singular Sibylla. This became her surname. Now, the Sibyls were, and it's funny because there's a movie out there called The Many Faces of Sybil, and it's regarding a woman. It's an old movie, but it's about a woman who has multiple personality, or DID, dissociative disorder, okay? Multiple personalities, in which she is overtaken by an entity and she acts out that character, if you will. And then she talks about, they talk about having a core person or a core personality in which they have been fragmented, as if the psyche can be fragmented. But this, I believe, is also a lie. It's part of that fantasy realm, okay? That hallucinogenic, where the individual does in fact experience a tripping in the brain. Matter of fact, the hormone that's responsible for inducing hallucinations is tryptophan, right? And tryptophan is where we get the word trip, from LSD, like you're tripping. That's exactly why they use that term. So they were localized traditionally at all the famous oracle centers and elsewhere. So these are Sibyls, okay? Now, in a legend, listen to this. In a legend about the Sibyl of Cumae in Italy, she accompanied Aeneas on his journey to the underworld. This is just basically a legend. And you can find that in Virgil's book. According to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a famous collection of sibylline prophecies, the Sibylline books, was offered for sale to Tarquinius Superbus, the last of the 7 kings of Rome, by the Cumaean Sibyl. He refused to pay her price, so she burned the books, and she said, you know what, forget it. I'm going to give you 3 for the same price. So he bought them. Now we have the Sibylline oracles. Now these are different because you have the Sibylline books and you have the Sibylline oracles. Now these oracles were basically a collection of prophecies, listen, in which Jewish, at that time, or Christian doctrines were allegedly confirmed. So these individuals who called themselves Jews and Christians would actually go to these Sibyls and ask them to authenticate or authorize something. Now the prophecies were actually the work of certain Jewish and Christian writers from about 150 BC to on, okay? These are not the Sibylline books. These are the oracles. The books were actually much earlier prophecies. Now, in these particular oracles, the Sibyl provided her reliability by first predicting events that had already occurred. You can bank on me because I'm going to tell you what happened yesterday. Okay? Recent events. But she then, I know this is not a laughing matter, but I just was like, oh my gosh. She then predicted future events and set forth doctrines peculiar to Hellenistic Judaism and Christianity. In fact, a Judean or Babylonian symbol was credited with writing the Judeo-Christian Sibylline oracles. Go look them up, of which 14 books survived. The Sibyl came thus to be regarded by some Christians as a true prophetic authority comparable to the Old Testament. I mean, and did you know that Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel is completely, arrayed with these Sibyls, these oracles of Apollo? Watch, and he actually alternates the Sibyls and the prophets together. Bet you didn't know. Yeah. Now, the Jewish apologist Josephus, I was like, really? And certain Christian apologists thought the works of these Sibyls were genuine prophecies, even though they were receiving their divination from other gods. They were greatly impressed by the way in which their doctrines were confirmed by external testimony. Both Theophilus of Antioch and Clement of Alexandria, 2nd century Christian theologians, referred to the Sibyls as prophetesses, apparently no less inspired than the Old Testament prophets. Now it makes sense in the book of Revelation where it says you tolerate that woman Jezebel. In other words, you are going to these prophets, these false prophetesses, these oracles, these Sibyls that are possessed with unclean spirits, and you are acquiring doctrines and knowledge, and you're teaching my people. You see that? To eat food sacrificed to idols, to live lascivious lifestyles, to practice sexual immorality. Now it makes sense to me. I was like, she wasn't even alive. Okay. So it's certain that when one Christian writer, Athenagoras of Athens, wrote a plea for the Christians to Emperor Marcus Aurelius in 176 AD, at a time when Christians were being persecuted by the Roman Empire. He quoted word for word from these oracles that are known today. This is what he quoted. He says, he quoted also by Homer and Hesiod. He wrote that, you know these books, he said to the emperor, you know all these books, you know these writings, you know these words already. Why are you behaving this way? You know what was prophesied, okay? So the sibling books then remained in the temple of Apollo at Rome at this time. So it is thought possible that at least some of these sibling oracles were partially the same. All right. Sibling books. The sibling books were a collection of prophecies in rhyme written in Greek. The legendary king of Rome, Tarquinius, his last name was Superbus, right? He was superb, bought them from a Sibyl, and the prophecies he would then use them to consult in times when great danger happened in the history of the Roman Empire. So you see, remember we had another show I presented on the wise counselor and what it meant to receive counsel, right? Wise counsel, and why the enemy is always vying to counsel, to goad you in a particular direction. Well, all kings had counsels. They all had counsel. They still do. All leaders should have counsel. This is why it's good to remain in the company of believers, so we can be accountable. That's, in other words, we can counsel one another, encourage each other. But it's interesting that these individuals would go to these false, of course, right? Because they were not appointed. They were self-appointed men and women. Now, the books were also known to the Greeks. They were kept in the temple of Apollo at Girgis on Mount. Okay, you already know all that. From there, it was passed down to Erythrae in Eastern Asia Minor and was called the work of the Erythraean Sibyl. Now, the reason why I bring this up is you're going to see in just a second. And so then it eventually went into Italy and then Rome. Oops. All right. So there was servants called the keepers. Okay, they were called the keepers. And these keepers were employed by the emperors. And the job of the keeper was to consult the books on behalf of the emperors or the inquirers, but they would consult the books on what was the right action or ceremony in order to escape from certain threats. Even so, they would listen, they would not reveal the prophecies themselves because they couldn't understand them. They mixed stuff up. These were like the fake magicians of Pharaoh, right? They would mix stuff up. They would not reveal the prophecies, but they would basically tell the individual what action was needed, what you got to do. This is what you got to do. They didn't understand, just like some people, they don't understand the scriptures, but they want to tell everybody how to live, right? They themselves lacking understanding. They can't walk in the truth yet, but they want to tell everybody else how to walk in the truth, right? Now, the influence of the books brought Eastern gods such as Apollo into Rome. Okay, this is into Rome. The Great Mother, Sibyl, and Ceres, as well as Greek pagan beliefs into the Roman pagan religion. Okay, check this out. Now, because the verses were written in Greek, the keepers would require help from translators. The books were eventually destroyed when the temple of Jupiter burned down. Because of this, the Roman Senate, look at this. They were, because I'm telling you, it's a high. They were so desperate to say that we were appointed because we have counsel, right? We take counsel. What did the woman do in the garden? She took wicked counsel, right? She took counsel from the serpent. Hello, the wise serpent. He wasn't wise at all. But because of this, the Roman Senate sent messengers in 76 BC to find similar prophecies and replace them. Well, can we find something similar? I don't know. What's his name? They came out of Rome, and a bunch of his stuff came true. Oh my gosh, I had his name on my mind. I'm sure you all know. What was his name? Oh, I can't think of it. Oh, okay, it's gonna bother me. He predicted the airplane. Nostradamus. Yeah. So this is what they did. They said, go find some similar prophecies and bring them back and we'll replace them. Okay. Now the prophecies were gathered especially from Troy, Erythrae, Samos Island, Africa, modern Tunisia, and from Sicily and Tibur in Italy. After they brought the new collection to Rome, Roman priests separated what they thought was true, but then they threw the other ones out. Sound about right? Right? You keep what you want. tickling ears, right? Oh, you know what? Did I? Oh, I don't think I put it in here. Oh, listen to this. Okay, quoting them along the ways of the Homer. Okay, so the sibling books remained in the temple of Apollo at Rome at this time. So it is thought possible that at least some of these sibling oracles were partly the same. Okay, but look it down here. It says 70 lines. 70 lines agreed. This is, they're trying to determine authenticity here between the books and the oracles. 70 lines agreed to be from the real sibling books, which were quoted in the 2nd century Book of Marvels, which I'm looking for, by Phlegon of Tralles. Now, listen to this. This quote speaks about the birth of a hermaphrodite and ceremonies for sacrificing to that idol. Imagine a hermaphrodite. Makes sense to me. All right, let's get back to, we don't have much more, but I wanted to show you the part where it was actually called the Capitol Hill. That's where they put the temple, Capitol Hill. No, I don't want to stop sharing. Y'all having a good time? It's a lot of information, right? But it's necessary. Oops. Hang on, guys. Here we go. All right, so back to our presentation here. So soothsaying, okay, Sibyls, we just looked at Sibyls and the like, okay, and where these sources come from. Now, what's interesting is that we were looking at the book of Acts, in which the young girl had the spirit of Python. She was a ventriloquist. She had a Python spirit, a spirit of divination. And Luke and others in their gospel use this particular word here, which means to divine or to soothsay, to utter oracular speeches, being possessed of this Python spirit. That's what it means, Python. And it comes from the Hebrew word, listen to this, chasam, which basically means to determine by lot or a magic scroll, by implication to divine. It speaks of diviners and nations, the Balaam of false prophets, which is prohibited, okay? Now, in Deuteronomy, this is so good. In Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 14, let's look at that for a second. They're considered abominable practices. And starting with verse 9, it says, when you come into the land, which we're looking at serpent, Python, right? When you come into the land which Yahuah your Elohim is giving you, do not learn to do according to the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. Now focus on these two words here, enchanter and witch. What's interesting is that divination, he says, no divination, nor do you observe these times through divination, or consult an enchanter or a witch. What's interesting is that the word for enchanter is 5172, nachash, and the word for witch, hashaf. Why is that interesting? Well, because the word nachash is serpent from the garden. The serpent in the garden. You see that? The dragon of old. There it is, Nakash. Do not seek Nakash, okay? Deuteronomy 18:11, or one who conjures spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. Now remember, they're using these elements to induce their frenzy, their state. For whoever does these is an abomination unto Yahuah, and because of these abominations, your Elohim drives them out from among you. So be perfect, he says, be mature before Yahuah your Elohim, be blameless. For these nations whom you are possessing do listen to those using magic. They were using magic, and to diviners. They were not magic themselves. They were using the elements. But as for you, Yahuah your Elohim, he has not appointed you for such. Very interesting, huh? Divination, an observer of times, or an enchanter, a witch, he says, Nakash. Now, remember, again, looking back at the Oh, yeah, I have a little note here. Oh, yeah, it's right here. Okay, so a certain damsel, remember back in Acts, possessed with a spirit of divination, literally, as in the margin, a spirit of Python. That's what it says. A spirit of Python. We just saw that. Or as some give it, a Python spirit. But recall, the Python was the serpent worshipped at Delphi as the symbol of wisdom, from whom the Pythian priestess took her name, and from whom Apollo, as succeeding to the oracular power of the serpent, took the same adjective. Now, the fact that Luke describes this phenomena is coming from that word demonia, where we get the word demon, demoniac, evil spirits, unclean spirits. This would imply either that this is the way in which the people of Philippi spoke of the maiden, she was demon possessed, or else that he recognized her phenomena as those of the priestess of Delphi. Yes. Makes sense. What were they? The wild distortions, the shrill cries, the madness of an evil inspiration, very much like that kundalini video that we just saw. Now, remember, she was a slave to her masters, right? And check this out, man. Words mean things. As a slave, her masters would trade on her supposed inspiration and made the girl answer to those who sought for oracular guidance in the perplexities of their lives. I'm confused. I don't know what to do. I need counsel. I need wisdom, right? Just like going to the serpent of old. This is the tree. This is the corrupt tree. You see, this is what it would have been like going to these soothsayers. It would have been like going to that tree, eating the leaves of that tree and getting high, right? Changing your paradigm. Oh, it is good. She probably, was a vapor. There's the dragon, right? And and that's exactly what Nakash means. If you go look up the word serpent in Genesis, it's the word Nakash, and the root of that word means a soothsayer, a fortune teller, a sorcerer, a whisperer of magic spells, a clairvoyant, a charmer, like a Prince Charming, right? So as a slave, she was being manipulated and used. And imagine, instead of releasing her, instead of praying for her and providing relief from that oppressive spirit, instead, what did they do? They monetized her. Wow. Now, after the manner of Sibyls, sorceresses, clairvoyants of that time, the girl whom Augustine describes as, this is the word he used, femina ventriloqua. So a feminine spirit, a feminine ventriloquist, right? The phrase probably expressing the peculiar tones characteristic of hysteria. Ventriloquism is hysteria. Now, what's interesting is that this word, Plutarch, speaks of the name Python also being applied commonly in his name to ventriloquists of this type. All right, we're pretty much done here. Prophesying, right? Exactly expresses the force of the Greek verb and her, let's see, how many more do I have? I think that's it. Greek verb, and her wild cries were caught up and received as oracles. So this is, again, exactly what can you all see me? Am I still connected? Yes, I don't know. It says that I'm off here. Oh, okay. Well, I hope you can see me. Yes? Salts. Yes, bath salts, slats. I don't know. Am I good, David? Hi, David. Am I good? I just want to make sure that I'm good. We're pretty much done here. Let me change it up. Hold on. All right. Let me see. I think I went through all that. Hang on. I'm going to conclude. We did that. Yeah, actually, hey, we did it. Yeah, so good. I said, oh, this is way too much information. We're not going to be able to get through it. All right, so let's conclude. So what we're looking at here first is this spirit of Python. Again, what is the Python? Calls himself Apollo, calls himself Zeus, calls himself Hermes. He just calls himself whatever will fit into the culture of that time. But in reality, we see that this spirit of Python is connected to the dragon or the serpent that invokes a delusional state in which the host is then manipulated or used. And what's really sad is that the hosts back then, these women, they would not live very fruitful lives. They were dedicated to the temple, although they would be accepted in because a lot of times they were poor or uneducated, and sometimes they were aristocrats. Sometimes they were very educated people. It just depended. I think what the spirit behind that was looking for was someone who was not only gullible, right, but maybe even possess some sort of charisma or charismatic spirit in which other people would, enjoy going to her. I mean, imagine if they didn't like her, people wouldn't listen to her oracles, right? And so they were probably looking for a good salesperson. And so oftentimes these women would, if they were married, they would divorce their husbands, or they would leave their families or their children, and they would go and serve in the temple, and they would be isolated, but they would enjoy provisions from the state, welfare. They would provide homes for them, food for them, clothing, finances, and then they also enjoyed the benefit of the community, the upper class, right? They were because they were very prestigious individuals, and they loved the they loved the accolades, if you will. So, but a lot of them didn't live very long. A lot of them didn't live very long because they were ingesting these chemicals and these drugs. But again, look at how easy it is to manipulate the people. And the people were convinced that wasn't, they didn't understand these earthquakes. They believed that a god was responsible for the earthquakes. Therefore, whatever was coming out of that chasm, right? Whatever was coming out of that chasm was the result of a god manifesting itself, and such that they would experience the embodiment of that God. Now, if you stay tuned, we're going to talk about true spirit of prophecy. Well, in fact, I think perhaps I should do it tomorrow, because that was a lot. And I'm not sure if we could keep going for another 2 hours. I mean, I can, right? Oh, you know what? Very, very true. So if you have any questions or comments, or you want to discuss it, let's do it. I have a few more minutes before the next show starts, or presentation. And the next presentation actually talks about the true spirit of prophecy, which actually I think I will do tomorrow. Let me pray about it. Let me see what y'all wants. But yes, the Apollyon, the destroyer, absolutely. Actually, I talk about that in the next presentation, because Apollyon, the dragon that comes out of the bottomless pit, is called Apollyon from Apollo, which is from this word destruction. So then what is destruction, right? Destruction comes to those, the word says that, Yah says that my people perish for lack of knowledge or vision, right? So we see then that the destroyer, he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Well, how does he do that? By veiling. Remember this woman, she wore a purple veil, a scarlet veil. So by veiling not only the hearts of men, the desires, so that their desires line up with his desires, but they veil the mind, which is symbolic for understanding, right? So the place of understanding. So they're veiled, and this brings destruction, utter destruction. Oh, Dustin says, I'm going to be with my babies tomorrow. Okay, any questions, comments? I encourage you all to research this even more. Y'all good? Okay, let's do it. Okay, we're going to do part 2. Come back. Let me take a little break. And we'll come back and we'll do some more. We'll get her done tonight. Praise Yah. And because it's important that we be able to discern. And I hope that was really clear. I hope that wasn't difficult to understand. But the shame, this is also like, if you look at the doors, I wanted to bring this up. So shamanism, this was actually, many authors compared this behavior to shamanism. And what's interesting is that a lot of the 1970s, 60s and 70s, well, 60s, think about the individual artists who are up on stage and they invoke this whatever, and they enter into this frenzied state, right? And they're up there dancing in a frenzy, and and they got all this energy, well, back in the 60s, you had a lot of people smoking things they shouldn't be smoking, dropping LSD, eating shrooms, and Eastern mysticism had actually entered into America. as a result of their rebellion, right? And they were seeking these yogis and these gurus for spiritual guidance, and they were all in the Jesus hippie movement, love movement, and you see that right there in Revelations. You allow this woman, these oracles, to come in and to teach sexual immorality. Well, it's a byproduct of the spirit of Python or Jezebel, or spirit of deception. When you're struggling with sexual immorality or even the impulse, that is usually tied or connected to that immoral or perverse spirit. So back then in the 60s and the 70s, that's exactly the 60s and 70s, right? But since the beginning of time, but we see it very prominent in the 60s through the culture, through the music. And remember, I said earlier that Apollo was known as the god of media. We're actually going to look at, eventually, we're going to look at all these strongholds, but media, if you knew about media, is actually a goddess of media and entertainment. But anyhow, he was the god of art and music and harmony. And so interesting, right? But these individuals like the Doors, right? What was his name? Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, right? Janis Joplin, Led Zeppelin, like, I was into rock, but all these individuals, they were intoxicated constantly, right? But if you ever watched the Doors movie, which I did when I was young, you will see an account of where he actually would get high, go on stage, and he would become frantic, on the stage, and he would go, and he would actually say that he was experiencing shamanic tantrums or results of this gods that were entering him and whatnot. But he was under he actually practiced shamanism, and so they would tantrums and fits of rage and whatnot, very, very similar to this spirit. Think about that. Intermission. Yeah, let's do it. We got 5 more minutes. So no questions after all that? Nothing you can relate to? I'm on the main screen now. I don't know what that means. Oh, good. I think you guys are a little behind me. All right, so we're going to call it a night. I'll come back at 6:15. Be sure, go take a little break, get some popcorn. It's going to be a good one. It is the spirit of prophecy, and we're going to talk about Yahuah's way and what it means to actually be a prophet. Praise Yah. I know. Yes, Deanne. Deanne says, and they're all dead. Absolutely. Their lives were cut short, right? Their lives were cut short as a result. All right. Sounds good. I'll see y'all back here at 6:15. Shalom.